In Yu-Gi-Oh!, a hand trap is a card which activates during your hand from either player's turn in response to an opponent's action or an effect with the goal disrupting your opponent's plays. Some hand traps, however, are more useful than others and can either have terrible effects or just do nothing to justify their activation conditions. So this list will be focused on the worst of the hand traps in the game and why they should be avoided when deck building. And at number 10, we have Kuriboh, a level 1 Dark Fiend monster with 300 attack and 200 defense, with the simple effect that during damage calculation, if an opponent's monster is attacking, you can discard Kuriboh from your hand to take no battle damage from that specific battle. Now, in the anime, Kuriboh was often mocked for being one of the weakest monsters in the game, but you might be surprised to know that Kuriboh actually saw a fair amount of competitive play. From 2005, even so far as up to 2007 as a tech option in some side decks in order to counter one-turn kill strategies like the infamous Cyberstein OTK, and can even be used against modern OTK decks like Gren Maju in the same capacity. So why does Kuriboh make it onto the list? While the card can certainly prevent you from being OTK'd, there are simply better options available, like Battle Fader and Swift Scarecrow can prevent the battle from even occurring and end the battle phase entirely, stopping every attack the opponent can make while also preventing you from taking battle damage. Although both Battle Fader and Swift Scarecrow do only trigger when a direct attack is declared. But even within its own archetype, Rainbow Kuriboh and Sphere Kuriboh are arguably the better cards since they can also ensure your monsters aren't destroyed by battle. Rainbow Kuriboh preventing the monsters from attacking, and Sphere Kuriboh by switching the attacking monster to defense mode. In fact, Sphere Kuriboh saw a lot of play in both Duel Links and Speed Duels for this reason. Although in the TCG, there is the argument that Sphere Kuriboh doesn't work as well because Link monsters can't go to defense position. All in all, while Kuriboh has had its uses, it takes number 10 spot on this list as its particular niche is currently filled by other cards which do its job way better. Though Kuriboh isn't a terrible choice if you need to play a hand trap to potentially survive an extra turn or two against OTK strategies, since it's not once per turn, and can be used against multiple high attack monsters provided you have multiple Kuribohs to discard. So there are certainly worse options like some of the higher spots on this list. And at number 9, we have Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, a level 3 zombie tutor monster belonging to the Ghost Girl or Yokai series of cards, which brought about some of the strongest hand traps in the game, like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit and Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. So you would think this card would be equally as powerful. Yet its effect is much worse compared to the other Ghost Girls. It's a hard once per turn and can be activated at any point during either player's turn, except the end phase, and has the effect that every time your opponent special summons an effect monster, during the main or battle phase you gain life points equal to that monster's attack. But it comes with the major downside that if you don't gain any life points with the effect of Spooky Dogwood, your life points are halved instead. At first glance, this seems like an influential effect similar to that of Max C, a card currently banned in the TCG due to its effect to draw one card every time your opponent special summons a monster, creating an environment in which your opponent is disincentivized from special summoning in order to put a stop to your opponent from generating card advantage. In a similar capacity, Spooky Dogwood disincentivizes the opponent from special summoning to prevent your opponent from gaining a whole bunch of life points, and incentivizes not special summoning at all to ensure life points are halved, which sounds strong on paper. However, the main difference between Max C and Spooky Dogwood is that in Yu-Gi-Oh, card advantage is much more important when compared to life points. With Max C drawing one card on every summon, it makes it more likely that you're going to draw into another powerful hand trap, like Nibiru the Primal Being, a game-determinative board breaker, like Forbidden Droplet, or a necessary piece of their engine that their deck needs to build their own board. Spooky Dogwood does none of these things, and while it can accumulate a lot of life points to prevent you from being OTK'd on your next turn, it's more than likely that your opponent will have gained a lot more in resources, card advantage, and board presence by the time they're done with their combo. Enough to stop your potential plays and eventually reduce your life points to 0, even if it's over the course of several turns. With all that being said, the reason why Spooky Dogwood only takes number 9 spot on this list is because it actually saw and still occasionally sees some amount of competitive play, which is surprising to hear since life points usually don't matter in Yu-Gi-Oh! Due to the way current time rules work in Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 8, we have Wattkinetic Puppeteer, a level 4 light psychic monster with 1800 attack, and its only ability is its hand trap effect, where you can discard Wattkinetic Puppeteer in order to target any monster your opponent controls and move it to one of their other main monster zones. In the modern era, this effect is usually pretty bad, as moving your opponent's monsters to different zones rarely does much to affect their plays. Although, there are some instances in which Wattkinetic Puppeteer can actually make for a pretty effective hand trap, allowing you to set up your own plays for Mech Knight monsters by ensuring there are 2 more cards in a column, floodgate your opponent by putting their monsters in the same column as an S-Force monster you control, or more commonly and more likely, mess with the effects of certain Link monsters that require the arrows to be set up in specific ways in order to activate and resolve their effects, such as the case of Guard Dragon Pitsy. If Pitsy is moved by the effect of Wattkinetic Puppeteer, so there's no zone in which 2 link monsters point to, then it won't be able to special summon a dragon from the graveyard. In fact, Wattkinetic Puppeteer actually saw a minor amount of competitive play during Master Rule 4 as a niche hand trap option which could prevent certain effects from being used. Stop extra links, which would prevent you from special summon at all from the extra deck, or to change where your opponent's link arrows point to in order to stop them from summoning more Synchro, Fusion, Xyz, Pendulum, or Link monsters from the extra deck. Currently though, in the Master Rule 4 revisions, you can special summon Synchro, Fusion, Xyz monsters to any available zones, meaning that Wattkinetic Puppeteer has far less of an impact in that regard, but can still potentially give Pendulum and Link decks fewer arrows for them to special summon and swarm the field, and does still have applications against or with certain strategies which either require columns or Link arrows to function well. Although its current usage is extremely niche and doesn't justify the -1 in card advantage, as you'd usually be better off by just playing other, more impactful hand traps with a wider range of use. Still, for its niche application, it's not the worst card in the world, and being hyper-specific is something that Puppeteer shares with the next card in this list. And at number 7, we have Engraver of the Mark, a level 4 Dark Spellcaster monster with 2 fairly unique effects. Its on-field effect is that during either player's turn, you can target 1 card in the field to destroy it during the end phase of the next turn. This is an extremely slow effect in the same vein as Swordsman from the Distant Land and Zone Eater, as while it has the potential useful effect to destroy any card in the field, it does so during the end phase of the next turn, meaning your opponent will more than likely have a chance to use that card in some capacity, as material to summon out a monster from the extra deck in the case that you targeted a monster, or just by using that spell or trap card that's targeted before it gets destroyed. The on-field effect has some niche applications against particularly hard-to-out floodgates like Gozid Match or There Can Be Only One, but even then, regular spell and trap removal like Mystical Space Typhoon or Twin Twisters is both easier to use and deals with floodgates more quickly, rather than needing to wait an entire turn. The more interesting part of this card, however, is its ability to be used as a hand trap. It has the in-hand effect that during either player's turn when your opponent activates a card or effect by declaring a card name, you can send Engraver of the Mark from your hand to the graveyard to declare another card name from the one initially declared, and then your opponent's declared name becomes the one you declared instead. So, if your opponent is trying to use a card like Prohibition to stop you from using one of your key combo pieces or end board bosses, you can chain Engraver of the Mark to declare one of their key combo pieces to lock them out of the game instead. Engraver of the Mark's hand effect does have some applications against Crossout Designator, a card currently seeing meta play for its ability to stop hand traps, and Crossout Designator just so happens to declare a card name upon activation. Meaning that if you try to hand trap your opponent and they attempt to stop you by using Crossout Designator, you can, like with Prohibition, chain Engraver of the Mark to declaring one of their key cards, which not only ensures your other hand traps aren't negated, but that a really important card they may need to finish their combo is negated instead. The main reason this card's on this list, despite its unique and seemingly powerful effect, is due to the fact that, because it's so niche, it only has a few cards which it can really counter, and most of those cards haven't and are unlikely to see competitive play. Even in the case of Crossout Designator, there are other better counter cards which have a wider coverage of applications, like Artifact Lancia, which can also floodgate the opponent out of banishing cards for the turn, causing Crossout to resolve without any effect since it needs to banish a declared card, all while preventing your opponent from activating other cards like Pot of Desires or any of the Phantom Knight graveyard card effects. Engraver of the Mark, however, is potentially a card to keep an eye on and could even become more powerful hand trap if more cards are released which declare a card name. But for the time being, its applications are far too small for it to be really considered above other hand traps. But its interesting effect brings it to the number 7 on this list, yet you might be surprised to hear that the next card on this list has an even weirder effect. And at number 6, we have Bahalutia, the Grand Radiance, a level 7 light dragon monster with a really odd effect. During your opponent's main phase, when a card is added from the deck to their hand, you can tribute summon the Grand Radiance. Usually, because it's a level 7 monster, you would need to tribute summon 2 monsters to do this. However, the Grand Radiance can also be summoned by distributing any one effect monster. And when it's successfully summoned from the hand, you can make your opponent banish the top cards of the deck face down, equal to the number of cards they have in their hand. Then your opponent shuffles their entire hand into their deck, and if they do, they add the cards you banished to their hand. So, the idea of this card is that you wait for your opponent to search out for a particularly important card, and then cut off access to that card by forcing them to shuffle their hand into their deck and giving them new cards, which are hopefully less strong than the cards you shuffled back, giving it a similar use to cards like Drone Lockbird and Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, both of which are extremely powerful cards in their own right, which cut off access to strong engine pieces. So, why doesn't Bahalutia compare? Well, part of the reason why hand traps are usually so strong, and why they've seen meta play for over a decade, is that they're powerful tools to interrupt your opponent's plays and make going second a lot easier. Bahalutia, however, requires that you tribute summon in order to summon it from your hand during your opponent's turn, meaning that you need to already control a monster for this card to be useful, making it a hand trap that's only capable of performing well when you're going first to set up a monster to tribute it. So it loses a lot of versatility compared to other hand traps. And furthermore, when you consider that its effect has a chance to potentially give your opponent an even better hand than the one once had, then it appears extremely weak and sometimes even beneficial to your opponent, which is why Bahalutia makes it cleanly on this list. And at number 5, we have Confronting the Sea, a level 5 Earth insect monster belonging to another series of monsters, the Sea Monsters. Like the Ghost Girl series, most of the Sea Monsters are hand traps with specific effects in order to counter different things your opponent is trying to do. The infamous and aforementioned Maxi gains advantage from your opponent's special summoning monsters. Flying Sea stops your opponent from Maxi summoning, and Retaliating Sea is basically a macrocosmos. Confronting the Sea, on the other hand, doesn't hold a candle to any of these effects. It can special summon itself from your hand when your opponent summons a monster from the extra deck, and if it's summoned in this way, it's unaffected by monster effects that target it. Additionally, this effect doesn't seem half bad, as you essentially get a free level 5 monster that's particularly difficult to deal with, especially with a rather beefy defense of 2500, even if its attack is somewhat lacking. And being unaffected is the strongest type of protection a card can have. The main issue with Confronting the Sea is that while it doesn't lose you any advantage since it's a free summon from your hand, assuming your opponent summons a monster from the extra deck, it doesn't really gain you any advantage or impede your opponent at all. So, while it's technically card neutral, it doesn't really do anything. In comparison, Contact Sea is technically a -2 in card advantage, as not only are you losing a card from your hand, you're giving your opponent an extra card. Yet Contact Sea has seen a lot more competitive play than Confronting the Sea ever has. This is because despite Contact Sea giving your opponent a free monster, it also floodgates the opponent of special summoning monsters from the extra deck unless they use Contact Sea as material. This can be particularly awkward for XCs or fusion decks, since Contact Sea's level, type, and attribute are all very awkward. Even against Tri-Brigade, Contact Sea acted as a direct counter to them, as after a Tri-Brigade monster has used their effect, they can't use any other monsters except Beast, Winged Beast, and Beast Warriors as materials to link summon, and Contact Sea happens to be an insect-type monster. So, you would essentially stop your opponent from summoning links for the turn. In contrast, Confronting the Sea is card neutral, but doesn't do anything but exist on the field. And while its protection is somewhat strong, not only can it still be destroyed by battle, it can also be removed from the field by any spell or trap effect, or even any monster effect so long as it doesn't target it. Still, Confronting the Sea can have some minor use and could even potentially help out some rank 5 strategies in swarming the field, since they usually require at least one monster tribute to summon, and it could potentially be annoying to deal with, but it simply doesn't do anything to really interrupt your opponent, kinda like the next card on this list. And at number 4, we have Time Escaper, a level 2 Earth Psychic monster with a hand trap effect specifically designed to protect other psychic monsters, where you can discard Time Escaper from your hand during your opponent's turn to target and banish one psychic monster you control into your next standby phase. Conceptually, the idea behind Time Escaper is actually pretty interesting. You can use Time Escaper to protect your psychic boss monster on the field, including monsters that were special summoned from the extra deck. So, if you're worried that your opponent may destroy your Full Metal Foe's Alcahest, you can simply discard Time Escaper to banish it, and the monster it banishes will return to your next standby phase, letting you keep your psychic monster to deal with your opponent's board on the next turn. This card isn't the worst thing in the world if you really need to protect your psychic monsters, but there are a couple of key issues with it. It can open you up to potentially getting OTK'd by your opponent's board, and chances are, if they have the ability to threaten your psychic boss monsters, they're likely to end up dealing a ton of damage to you if they don't kill you instantly. And secondly, it has very few good targets to banish. Currently, the strongest and most easily accessible psychic-type boss monsters in the game are Time Thief Redoer, Psyframe Lord Omega, and Virtual World QB Shenshen, each of which have the ability to either banish themselves to dodge card effects anyway, in the case of Redoer and Omega, or can infinitely resummon themselves like Shenshen can. In essence, there aren't really good targets to protect with Time Escaper. But if your deck just so happens to end on a psychic-type monster that doesn't have a way to protect itself, then you can at least consider Time Escaper, even if there are a myriad of other ways that it can be done better. And at number 3, we have Gadget Driver, an Earth Machine hand trap which, despite its namesake, doesn't support the Gadget archetype. Instead, it actually supports the Morphtronic archetype. With no once per turn, during either player's turn, you can send Gadget Driver from your hand to the graveyard in order to target and change the battle position of a face-up Morphtronic monster you control. This can occasionally be somewhat beneficial, as the particular gimmick of Morphtronic monsters is they gain different effects depending on their battle position. So, if you control a face-up attack position Morphtronic Boomboxin, but are worried your opponent might beat over it with one of their more powerful monsters during the battle phase, you can activate Gadget Driver to change Boomboxin to defense mode and negate the attack. Or if you really need to protect your Morphtronic Slingon from being destroyed, you can use Gadget Driver to change it to defense position so you can destroy another Morphtronic card you control instead. In fact, Gadget Hauler can even be used offensively during your own turn to gain access to powerful effects of cards, like Morphtronic Vacuumin, which can equip your opponent's monsters to it, essentially acting as an easier to access reliquid. Despite this utility, however, Gadget Driver requires a fair amount of setup in order for you to get any use out of it, requiring that you both have it in hand and a Morphtronic with an effect that you're likely to use the effect of. So, even though it can technically disrupt your opponent, it's very situational, and given how weak the Morphtronic effects can be, oftentimes it can have little impact. So you'd rather just run other hand traps instead. In fact, Gadget Driver, despite somewhat helping the Morphtronics with their gimmick, rarely sees any play within the archetype, as there are much better options to use rather than Driver. And furthermore, because Gadget Driver isn't technically a Morphtronic card, you can't even special summon it or search for it with the effects of Morphtronic Selfon and Morphtronic Smartphone respectively, making it a card you have to draw to see any use out of. And it can even be detrimental since it dilutes the concentration of Morphtronic names for Selfon and Smartphone, making it occasionally even a detriment to the archetype it was meant to support, which is why it deserves the number 3 spot on this list. Rocketing to number 2 is Savant Galilei, the first and only pendulum monster on this list. It's a Dark Fiend monster with 0 attack and defense, and a scale of 1 with a pendulum effect that states, you cannot pendulum summon monsters except DD monsters, and during your standby phase, increase the pendulum scale of Galilei by 2, and if you do, destroy all monsters you control with a level equal to or lower than its pendulum scale, except DD monsters. Now, already, this isn't a great effect. Locking you into only pendulum summoning DD monsters and slowly destroying your non-DD monsters on the field can actively be a detriment to your plays, especially if you happen to splash other archetypes or boss monsters into your deck, like Borreload Savage Dragon for example. But the more relevant effect of this card, and the reason why it's on this list, is because of its rather weak monster effect, where during either player's turn you can discard Galilei to the graveyard in order to target a DD or Dark Contract card you control, and return it to the hand. Despite how weak this effect is, it does technically have a fair amount of utility, in a similar fashion to Time Escaper, where you can use it to protect every one of your contracts or DD cards, including your own boss monster, like DDD Devisor King Des Machinax. The main issue with this is that Galilei returns the monster to the hand. So, while Time Escaper would give your monster back to the next standby phase, you have to jump through all the necessary hoops in order to special summon back your DDD extra monsters, as they would be returned to the extra deck. So, what about returning Dark Contracts? While it is correct that you could activate the effect of Galilei in order to avoid taking the damage from your Dark Contract cards, like with Dark Contract with the Gate or Dark Contract with the Swamp King, DDD has other better options to use in order to avoid the damage. DDD Rebel King Leonidas, for example, not only gains back the life points you lose from your gates, it also special summons itself from your hand if you take effect damage, and also prevents you from taking effect damage while it's on the field. Even in Duel Links, where each player only has 4,000 life points, there are just better options available. And even an entire skill, Emergency Contract Laundering, dedicated to doing what Galilei does, but better. Although you could technically use DD Savant Galilei as a decent enough pendulum skill in a DD, and the effect might come up once in the blue moon, which is why it's not at the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1 is the worst hand trap in the game, Desrook Archfiend, a level 3 light fiend monster belonging to one of the first archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the Archfiends. An archetype which has a few gimmicks, 2 of the most consistent of which is their standby phase life point cost, and their ability to roll a die whenever they're targeted by a card effect to potentially negate that effect. And the effect of Desrook Archfiend states, you must pay 500 life points to each of your standby phases while you control it, and if it's targeted by an opponent's card effect, you can roll a 6-sided die, and if the result happens to be 3, you can negate and destroy the card, which would be pretty strong effect if it happened to hit 3 each time it was targeted. But unlike the other Archfiends, Desrook is also technically a hand trap. When a Terror King Archfiend you control is destroyed and sent to your graveyard, you can send Desrook Archfiend from your hand to the graveyard in order to special summon back that Terror King. Now at first glance, this effect doesn't appear to be worthy of the title of the worst hand trap in the game, since it can revive a fairly strong monster with a decent enough stat line. The main issue with this effect is just how difficult it is to set up and use for a payoff that just isn't worth it. You see, Terror King Archfiend can't be normal or flip summoned to your field unless you control an Archfiend monster, and most of the Archfiend monsters in the game don't really have easy ways to special summon themselves, making it hard for Terror King Archfiend to even be normal summoned to set up your Desrook Archfiend in the first place. But even if you manage to summon out Terror King Archfiend, it's not really a monster that's worth the payoff of keeping it around with Desrook, as while it potentially has a form of strong targeting protection, it isn't at all guaranteed, and despite being a normal summoned monster with 2000 attack, its stats don't really justify how hard it is to normal summon, even if it has a decent enough effect of negating monsters destroyed by battle with it. If Desrook Archfiend could trigger on any Archfiend monster's destruction and not just Terror King, then it might actually be a somewhat okay hand trap, as you could use it to revive a Summoned Skull or even a Red Dragon Archfiend, which are both technically Archfiend cards, or even a stronger monster like Archfiend Emperor, the First Lord of Horrors. But as it stands, Desrook Archfiend has an incredibly mediocre and specific payoff for how unwieldy and difficult it can be to use, especially with the abundance of non-destruction removal which now exists in the game, a lot of which doesn't even target, bypassing all of the protections of Terror King Archfiend and Desrook Archfiend completely, making them less than useless a lot of the times. If you ever manage to set up Terror King Archfiend and your opponent happens to destroy it and doesn't have the means to get over a 2000 attack point monster, then Desrook Archfiend might come in handy in this extremely specific situation, but it is more than deserving the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other bad hand traps you may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments.